explore that by asking, well, what does the question mean, really? Why wouldn't you ask a question? Why is that even a question, what Mark's gospel is for? So what I want to do in this, in the next 10 minutes or so, is really just to identify and talk through a few things that, if you've done any training as lay preachers or anything, you probably know much of what I'm going to say for the next 10 minutes. So don't be too bored, because I think this is important that we identify some of this stuff as a kind of launching pad for, what might be more creative stuff in a wee while. So you might be forgiven for thinking that a question like what is Mark's gospel for, if a question needs a further question in order to explain it, then it wasn't a very good question in the first place, was it? And I guess that might be the case if we were talking of something like, let's say, a Jane Austen novel or a Steven Spielberg movie. But to ask it of a key document in Christian scripture is a bit different. And it's a bit different because Christians of all persuasions would likely agree that in some way that we might all find challenging to define more exactly, Mark's gospel is authoritative, even inspired. And some people will say, well, surely that's a good enough answer to our question. It's there because it tells the story of Jesus, and that by itself is more than enough to justify its existence. But actually, suggesting that itself highlights the very nature of the question, because for sure, Mark's gospel tells the story of Jesus. But what sort of story is it? What makes it so special? So what I want to do is unpack that question with reference to a few facts that, as I say, many of you will be familiar with. But it's worth repeating here just to highlight all the many reasons why we might think that we don't need Mark's gospel at all. As I said earlier, I first read Mark's gospel seriously when I was probably aged about 14 in high school. And it all started with a challenge from a new teacher of religious studies, with whom, on his very first visit to our class, I had a somewhat embarrassing run-in that left me feeling I needed to know more about the Bible so that I could ask appropriately awkward questions of him the next time he came to our class. And I still have a vivid memory of raking through the pages of the New Testament to decide where I would start. And I ended up with Mark's gospel for a very simple reason. I counted the pages in each of the four gospels, and Mark was the shortest, which was, at the time, was a 14-year-old. As you can imagine, that was good news for me, because it meant I managed to read it all in just a little over an hour. And then when I subsequently moved on to reading Matthew and Luke, of course, I realized that I could have saved myself an awful lot of effort, because pretty much everything that Mark says is contained in one or other of those two. So even then, I was asking myself, what is the point of Mark's gospel? What is it for? And of course, when I dug into it a bit more a few years later, I discovered that more or less everything that's in Mark is there in Matthew and Luke. As we now know it, Mark has 661 verses. 606 of them are found in Matthew, more or less word for word the same, and about half of them are also contained in Luke. Not that putting it that way would make any sense, of course, to Mark himself, whoever or whatever that might have been. And we'll come back to who was Mark in due course, because the division of text into verses was a much later invention. But you get the picture. If you have Matthew in particular, why do you need Mark? Not only do these others contain all Mark's material and a lot more besides, but they do it in a much more organized and sophisticated format. So in terms of content, Matthew and Luke, plus John, of course, provide a much more comprehensive account of the entirety of Jesus' life. Mark tells us nothing about his origins, while each of the other three begin in more predictable ways. Matthew gives us a list of Jesus' forebears. Luke starts with his conception and birth. And of course, John has his own version of where Jesus started from. And then at the end of the story, something similar happens. The others provide considerable detail about the resurrection, while Mark, well, just leaves us hanging with a kind of question in a sentence that looks like it's only half finished, that he ran out of paper or something, or ran out of things to say, or ran out of ink, or whatever. In fact, his ending, in what we now call chapter 16, verse 8, was deemed to be so unsuitable for a gospel that even in the early centuries, people were adding their own endings to try and sort it out and make it look a bit more respectable. So if Mark can be seen as a bit deficient at the start, and certainly deficient at its ending, its style and contents, they don't do much for it either. Because, as was already commented in our conversations before we started formally, there's that constant repetition of just one word, immediately, which is so annoying that some modern translators just miss it out altogether. So depending what version of Mark you've got in front of you, you might even miss the fact that every story and every episode begins or ends, depending on how you look at it, with that word immediately. And in any case, when you look at it, it doesn't seem to mean immediately anyhow, because it doesn't seem really to be anything to do with measurement of time. So what is that about? Was Mark just basically incompetent as a writer? I mean, did he not know what he was doing? Because if you dig a bit further down, you discover that his narrative is full of, the sort of grammatical and other mistakes that even somebody who is just starting to learn the Greek that it's written in should be able to spot all the mistakes, and they do. I don't think the Greek of Mark's Gospel would get much of a grade if it was being presented, certainly not in a theological institution today anyway. And even if we overlook all that, then you've got to ask yourself, well, what sort of book is it? I mean, does it have a plot? Is there a storyline? I mean, does it have a beginning, a middle, and an end? Because when you dig into it, the arrangement of the stories can seem very random indeed. 100 years ago, scholars were describing them, each of these individual stories, as pearls on a string. But they weren't like a set of pearls that need to be in a certain order so that they're graded from bigger ones to smaller ones, because in Mark's Gospel, for the most part, it looks as if the order doesn't make any difference, really. And if the string had snapped and the pearls of wisdom all fell off, you could almost put them back in any order that you choose, which, of course, is more or less what the other two Gospel writers did with them anyway, because they don't consistently follow Mark's order, but they rearrange the various episodes to suit their own understandings of what Jesus was and what he did and taught. So these longer Gospels of Matthew and Luke are usually seen as consisting, as I'm sure many of you know, not just of all this stuff from Mark, but another source that's conventionally called Q, along with a few other bits and pieces. There's a lot of debate today about Q, whether it existed, what it was, whether it was written, whether it was not written. And talking about that would divert us considerably from the primary question here. But whatever its form might be, Q disappeared once it was all incorporated into the other two. So it's a good question, isn't it, to ask, well, why didn't something like that happen to Mark? I mean, why did Mark not disappear? Surely once you've got something in a vastly improved and expanded version, you don't need the original that you started from. It's like somebody writing an essay and keeping their very first draft along with the finished product just for, well, just to jam up their computer, I suppose, and occupy more space. Well, you'll not be surprised to know that over the last 2 centuries, an entire academic industry has grown up around all this, as scholars have tried to unravel these questions in the hope of finding a distinctive niche for Mark's Gospel. Nobody's ever proposed that we should ditch Mark entirely, in the sense of removing it from the New Testament, but for centuries it was neglected in favour of Matthew in particular. And even today, I think it's debatable whether we would really read it with any intentionality without the encouragement of the Revised Common Lectionary, which allocates a full year to it. Though, as you all know, and have discovered already in this year, it's supplemented with rather a lot of passages from other Gospels to compensate for its apparent deficiencies, especially around Advent and Easter. One of the reasons for keeping Mark expounded in the early church, in the early centuries, was the notion that its contents originated somehow with the disciple Peter. Now, this goes back to a man called Papias, who was a church leader in Hierapolis, which is now in Turkey, in the early 2nd century. And he described Mark as Peter's interpreter. And this is what he said, I'm quoting, that Mark wrote down accurately, but not in order, as much as he could remember of the things said and done by Christ. End of quotation. And these are claims that are repeated by various other writers in the early centuries. Well, that would certainly match the apparent piecemeal kind of nature of Mark's narrative, wouldn't it? Though I think it's hardly enough by itself to explain how and why Mark was preserved, and therefore what the gospel is actually for. Oh dear, you might be wondering by now, why am I giving up an evening to explore any of this? So let me just jump ahead for a moment, because later on, I want to suggest that Mark's apparent deficiencies are actually its major strengths. Here are some questions. What if his allegedly poor Greek is only poor by reference to the fancy terminology of historians or philosophers? What if it's not even meant to be a literary style, but is the way that ordinary people spoke in conversation every day? You see, even what I'm saying tonight wouldn't be expressed in the same way if I was writing it all down in a book or an article. The way we speak is different than the way we write. And then there's that irritating immediately. What if it functions in a way similar to the word Selah in some of the Psalms, as a kind of code word for something that was meant to happen at those points? And what if, far from being an incompetent writer, Mark was recording a form of communication that would engage the imagination of those non-literate masses of the Roman Empire? And that's the very reason that it might be a key resource for us today in a world where our sources of inspiration are largely derived from the visual and the interactive, rather than from books or academic discourse. So, to discover why I might think any of that is worth asking, you'll need to stay with us.